This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Is there something interfering with your happiness or is preventing you from achieving your goals?
Yes.
Well, BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist. You can start communicating in under 48 hours. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It is professional counseling done securely online.
What better time than now? I mean, I'm sure people are going through a lot of stuff through the pandemic.
Yeah, a lot of mental health awareness these days.
Yes, and BetterHelp will keep you out of the long waiting rooms. You do everything online, so you don't have to go into an office. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You can do it from the comfort of your own home. You can log into your account anytime to send a message to your counselor.
And they're supposed to get back to you almost immediately.
Yeah.
A friend of mine is using it, and she said that they do. They got back to her right away.
Yeah, and they've got tons of therapists on there. You can go on and pick one out and decide, what's good for you. They've got family counseling, drug and alcohol addiction, all that kind of stuff. So anything you might be dealing with, there's people there that can help.
What else could they be dealing with?
There's probably a lot of things, but the list could get long and we got to get to the podcast. So
BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit their website and read their testimonials that are posted daily. www.betterhelp.com/reviews for that, and you can get 10% off your first month if you use our promo code MIF10, MIF10, betterhelp.com/MIF10.
And that is BetterHelp, HELP, betterhelp.com. Go check them out.
This podcast is also sponsored by Pure Spectrum CBD.
Yeah, CBD is a big thing right now. I mean, they sell it in gas stations. You can buy it, anywhere. And it's kind of an unregulated industry.
Yeah, I had a weird experience where I got some Delta 8 gummies, and it was such a trip. It was not safe.
Right. If you go to Pure Spectrum CBD, you can trust these guys. They're from Colorado. They've been doing this for a long time. Everything's tested. They come from, I think it's a family farm in Colorado. So, CBD is great. It's great for aches and pains, all kinds of stuff.
Anxiety.
Yeah. And if you get it from Pure Spectrum CBD, you're not going to fail a drug test. You're not going to get high. It is pure CBD, just the medicinal qualities, and you can trust that.
Yeah, CBD is one cannabinoid away from THC, but it's not the psychoactive cannabinoid. So it's just all the healing properties of cannabis without getting high.
That part's kind of a bummer. But for those that don't want to get high, these guys are the one to go to get all of your CBD products. You can trust them. They've been around forever. And you can save some money with our promo code
MIF10. So go to purespectrum.com/MIF10 to get 10% off all your orders.
And that's MIF, MIF 10. Stands for music is funny, but it's shorthand. So anyway, check out Pure Spectrum CBD. And now, on to the show.
The more uncomfortable I was sharing something, the better it would work.
Live from the Willie Nelson and Friends Museum Showcase in Nashville, Tennessee. It's Music is Funny. Musicians talking to comedians about music and comedy. With your hosts, Raylan Nelson and Jonathan Bright.
I'm still smoking, I'm so high, I keep toking, I'm drunk, but I'm still drinking too.
Welcome back to Music is Funny. I'm Raylan Nelson.
And I'm Jonathan Bright from the Raylan Nelson Band. What's
Gary Gulman. Hey, Gary, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm Raylan, and this is JB, my co-host and music partner.
Oh, terrific. Nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you.
I'm really honored to be a part of this. I heard great things about you guys.
Oh, man, thanks for doing it, first of all.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to do it. You're the coolest. Thank you.
Not even close, but thanks.
Starting off good. So we generally start these things by just asking, what kind of music fan are you? And how early did you start? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like to ask, what's the first music you remember loving?
Oh, that's such a great question because nobody asks me that. And we're so excited about our music, our own music, and I'm constantly trying to get people to listen to my music. So this is a great question, and I'll answer now. Okay. So I have older brothers by like 9 years and 13 years, and they had a pretty good record collection. The first 3 albums I could remember them playing frequently were the first album by Boston that I can't think came out in 1976.
Yep.
Which for a time it was the most popular debut album I think of all time. I think.
Yeah, it was huge.
It was enormous, right? Okay.
Yes.
And then the other one, and this for a time was the greatest selling live album of all time, Frampton Comes Alive.
Oh, he started with two good ones.
Yeah, so there were two really good ones, and then the third one was, and it would probably be a tie. It was the third one that I remember them playing frequently. It was probably a tie between two albums. One was the older collection of the best of the Beatles. I think it was the blue album, maybe it was the red album, whatever it was a best of, and it was an incredible introduction to the Beatles. And then the other one was a Beach Boys best of that they played. So they had pretty good taste, but we didn't have a lot of money to buy a lot of albums, so there wasn't a great selection. But I remember those four albums being in constant rotation, and to this day I enjoy them immensely. I think maybe our brains are wired to keep coming back to those albums we first fell in love with, maybe because it always lifts my mood when any of those songs, even if they come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about that. It's sort of a time and place when you're young like that, pre-puberty almost even, or into your teenage years, that it becomes a soundtrack to all of those great, some of your favorite memories, or a lot of people's favorite. As a youngster, you automatically, when you hear those old songs, all of that other stuff just comes rushing back.
Yeah. I was only 5 or 6, and I had access to these. I mean, they're true classics because they still hold up. Yeah.
So when you got your teenage years, did you move on into did you kind of stay in that rock vein, or did you were you a big music fan after that, or is that just kind of the first stuff you listened to?
I think that I went from those albums, and then I got into more I guess rhythm and blues. I was really into. I mean, I had very odd taste, I think, for a single digit aged person, in that I loved Earth, Wind and Fire and Motown, and I remember I listened to Donna Summer a lot. And I guess I got into disco when that came out, but I also still loved a lot of those classic rock albums that my brothers played. And then I didn't abandon. It's interesting because I almost treat them like friends. There is no song that I was really into that I resist now, or that I'm sick of. I still hold them in the high regard.
Right.
I just kept accumulating. So I'm sure everybody thinks they have eclectic taste, but I got really into hip hop for a time, and some punk, and I got really into blues and Texas blues, and I really enjoy finding new bands, but I'm not as dedicated to that as I once was. I think that's something I regret, because I've never had more access to more different bands, and so I rely on recommendations from young people, because they continue to have the best taste, really. And I have a friend who always says, regarding comedy and music, he said, it's impossible that every other thing on the planet has gotten better, but music has stopped improving, and comedy has stopped improving. Right. I think that's a really wise approach. It would be impossible. The tastes, sometimes you don't gravitate to some of the newer stuff, but musicians are really talented, as they always have been.
Yeah,
it's true.
I always go back to, if you can create something out of nothing, then somebody's gonna like what you've created. You know.
Wow, that's a great philosophy. I love that, and it's the essence of art.
Yeah, Exactly.
Same like writing a joke, writing a song. All of a sudden, nothing's there.
Mm-hmm.
You get something, and just one person liking it. You're like, I mean, I think the big thing is just to do it, and then once you do it, you feel good about it. Like when we write songs, I'll listen to it 100 times in a row, going, "Oh, you just did that. That sounds great." When you get that one other person that goes, "Hey, man, that's really good," you're like, "Yes," you know.
Yes, it's so interesting how important the audience is for musicians and comedians, and it can be that one person, especially when that one person has taste that you admire or respect. So many jokes over the years I've thought I should abandon that, and then a comedian who I really like and whose taste I like will say that's a really good joke, and I'll return to it with renewed vigor and more importantly with confidence, because the audience may reject it, but that one member of the audience told me it was good enough, and I tell it with more spirit.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's good time to maybe get into comedy. So as far as comedy goes, how early were you into that? Like as a child, were you the funny kid in the family? I know with a couple of brothers, there had to be a bunch of busting going on anyway, but
yeah, that was, I mean, the important thing, I guess, and in your family with music, it was valued, and in my family, comedy was valued. So I was 5 or so when my brother started watching Saturday Night Live and getting really into Steve Martin. So that was like those were the first comedy albums that I listened to were Steve Martin's albums, and I listen to them now and I think I don't understand how I would have gotten the references and the ideas when I was 5 or 6.
I was just about to ask you, because I had the same experience, and I laughed. I knew they were supposed to be funny, but Grandpa bought a rubber. I had no idea what that meant. I just laughed at it, you know? And he was so silly that I think he was able to grab kids like us and go, well, whatever, you know, his physical stuff was hilarious. But
yeah.
I listened to those records a ton and got maybe 1 or 2 of the jokes, which is almost how does he pull that off? I don't think he gets enough credit being the comedian that he was, like groundbreaking.
Right, like but don't you feel like it almost transcended comedy into some sort of cosmic connection with his audience, because 5-year-olds and 35-year-olds were laughing hysterically at this man who just must have had his brain in tune with everybody's funny bone.
Yeah, and I can remember I got that record for one of my early on birthdays, and I can remember hearing my parents in the other room cackling because they understood the references and stuff. And you know, he's almost maybe there was somebody before, but he was almost that first rock star, big arena comedian.
Yes,
like nation, like people that weren't into comedy would see that, and it was before movies and shit. He was just doing comedy. It was pretty amazing.
Yes,
up to that point.
Yes, it was extraordinary and unique. There have been other comedians who've performed in front of that many people, but there haven't been comedians who were as innovative and really reinvented the medium like that. I'm still in awe of him, and I really enjoyed the book he wrote about that.
Oh, it's
about
great.
that time. It's really I've read it a couple times. It's so good. But I think that much like I wanted to circle back, but not use the expression circle back because everybody is using it now. But I wanted to also talk about the discovering of artists later in life, because that's a special thing too. And some of them I'm late to, and some of them are new artists. But I think, for instance, Bob Dylan was somebody that I didn't listen to growing up, and then at 33, a friend of mine gave me a compilation, and it was a revelation. And the same thing has happened again and again, where I just wasn't exposed. My brothers didn't listen to Dylan, and you get kind of intimidated by the catalog. And it happened with Willie too. And my friend insisted I get the Willie Nelson with Johnny Cash, and that was my jumping off point. And again, the catalog is intimidating, but it's just it's the equivalent of discovering it at 5 years old because it's such a rush.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, I'm roughly your same age, about Dylan. I was the same way, but when unless you were a kid in the '60s, he wasn't like your peer or the rock
Right,
happening.
right.
So it was all that protest stuff, and we were into Van Halen and AC/DC and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's a guy with an acoustic guitar. I don't need that right now. But to your point, you hear about it all the time. When you finally sit down and listen, you're like, oh, this is what they were talking about.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I rely on my kids and my little sister and my younger cousin to bring me new artists, bring me new bands, because I don't seek them out.
Well, even back in the day, or at least me, you'd have those one or two friends that would spend hours in record stores and go through all the magazines. I used to rely on them to tell me what was cool from the underground, So what are the new hits?
Yes.
And I was only, I was 18 years old, still asking, because I didn't have the time or desire to dig through it. I just want to hear the good shit.
Yes. But I mean, that's another thing that I love. There's so much great music journalism that there's something inspiring about reading the life stories of Bruce Springsteen was a great one that I read, especially when I was depressed. When I found out he was depressed, it made me feel so much better. For some reason, I just thought, oh, it's not my laziness or my lack of talent. This thing happens to people who are hardworking and talented. So there's something more to this. But I totally understand where you're coming from on that.
Yeah.
I'm curious to ask you, maybe I'm asking it a little too early, but what do you listen to in your free time? Do you listen to stand-up comedy or do you listen to music? Because you said,
or any any of that.
You're allowed to listen to other things too. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean I'll tell you what the 3 playlists I've been running through since the spring. I made a playlist of hip hop that I listen to when I'm shooting baskets at the court near my house. It starts with some Drake, but it goes all the way back to Eric B. and Rakim and Public Enemy.
Oh yeah.
And then I made this great I saw this great documentary about the Seattle scene. And I should say that I'll watch any rock and roll documentary, even if I don't know a single song. I didn't know anything about Rush before, other than their hits.
Right.
And I watched a documentary from like 10 years ago, and I fell in love with them as humans and as amazing, artists. Yeah, I mean, that's another great example of just they're so inspiring in their relationship with their fans. But then I'm always watching these rock and roll documentaries. So I was watching one about the Seattle scene, and I didn't realize how encouraging they were to each other, which is something that they were commenting on, that it was unusual in rock and roll that everybody be as supportive as they had been. And maybe they're exaggerating it in retrospect, but it seemed like a really productive and creative atmosphere. So I put together a playlist of Seattle, mostly with Chris Cornell, because he was in Soundgarden and Temple of the Dog, and then I got into Audio Slave, but also Nirvana and Screaming Trees and Alice in Chains and just
Mudhoney.
Yeah, Mudhoney. Oh my word! Yeah,
band.
just these great bands, and so I've been listening to that a lot, and then I've been listening to a friend of mine who actually also did the score for my last special. This guy named Andy Frasco in the UN, who's a lot younger than me, but his live concerts and his music is very inspiring, and I feel very, very close to him as a friend.
Sweet. So you grew up Massachusetts, right?
Yes, on the North Shore in a city called Peabody, which the most famous rock and roll person was a drummer named Jonathan Mover, who was in it. He was in a band called GTO, or GTR rather, GTR.
Yeah.
Yes, in the '80s, and
Was that like a super group or something that
it kind of was. But the interesting thing is that I find out that drummers of that caliber work a lot in studios and doing sessions
Yes.
and are on a lot of things. So yeah, so Peabody is right next to Salem, which is probably the more famous of the towns on the North Shore of Massachusetts.
Well, I think that GTR band, I could be wrong about this, it's been a long time, but they put out a record and it didn't go over all that well with the critics. And I remember the Rolling Stone review, it said GTR, and the review said SHT. And I was like, wow, hilarious, but brutal.
That sounds like a Spinal Tap.
It really does.
A Spinal Tap review.
Hilarious.
Shark sandwich, shit sandwich.
Yep, which is probably where they got their information or inspiration for sure.
Yeah. Oh, my word, that's hilarious.
Did your brothers do comedy or music? You said you
No, but my oldest brother was as a young man was hilarious, and then he got married and had children, and I think he minds his P's and Q's more than he used to. But I was just they loved to laugh. They loved comedy movies and comedians. So I knew where I could get some attention early on.
So they're older brothers?
Yes, by 9 and 13 years. Yeah.
Oh, so you were an only child for a while then once they got up and out of the house.
Yes. Yeah. From the time I was probably 8 or 9, it was just me and my mom.
That had to be kind of weird growing up with, I mean, they're not really another father figure, but being that much older, I would imagine a little beyond just brothers, it's like some people, and then they just
that's very insightful. They were more like fathers in many ways because they were grown men by the time I was a teenager. So they at the age where they love to impart wisdom, even though it hadn't been really proven yet.
Right. I know that age well. You know everything at that point.
Yes.
So what made you go, I think I'll try this comedy thing? I'm sure it was an open mic night, but was there encouragement or was it something you led up to, or did your buddies go, hey, you should try it? How did that work out?
Well, I'll ask you a question regarding this because this is how I think it happened. Was there ever a feeling when you went to rock concerts or music concerts and you thought, I don't belong in the audience. I want to be up on stage. I want to be, that seems so exciting and fun. And that's how I felt when I would go to comedy shows. I would think, I want to have the best spot for these things and have the people listen to me. So I think it was, it's delusional because I didn't have any special talents. I could be quick-witted and things, but as soon as I started, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not good at this at all. But there was something about enjoying it from the audience so much that I wanted to make it myself. I think that the feeling I would get even making a couple of people laugh was so exhilarating that I wanted to replicate it as soon as possible and as frequently as possible.
Well, I think maybe you have to be a little bit delusional to get into the arts at all because you're trying something that's basically statistically impossible to succeed at. And you're just going, I think I could do that. I got the same feeling from looking at the back of a Kiss album cover. I didn't even have to see it live. I just saw the fire and everything. I'm like, I'm going to do that. And I think a little bit of delusion, a couple of talent to even give it a shot, because it seems so insane.
Yeah, it's and then there's this thing I remember reading from Springsteen where he said you had to think you're a badass, but also that you suck simultaneously in order to improve, and it's such a weird razor's edge to walk on.
It's so true. We talk about it all the time. Everything I've ever done, I think is going to work, and I think it'll never work. Exactly at the same time. It's like, this is great. This is going to make $1 million. And I'm going, yeah, it's never going to make $1 million. And then, but I don't know, the half and half, it just kicks you into the next. If it doesn't work, you just move on to the next one. That's probably the part of the delusion, I guess.
Yeah, but it's there. There's also just every new effort and project. There's so much hope, and I think the bottom line, or maybe the theme of my life is I'm happiest at every point in my life when I'm following some sort of dream, no matter how absurd it is, whether it's wanting to be a basketball player or a comedian or any of the things along the way that were crazy at the time when I wanted to be I wanted to fly jets and these things and it gave me kind of a purpose and some focus.
So what age were you when you did your first comedy stuff?
I started writing down jokes when I was 19 years old,
Wow.
and I gave myself the excuse that I would wait until I finished college to try it out. I would say I'm too busy with studying for tests and writing papers to give this the proper effort that it deserves. So as soon as I graduate from college, I'll try, and that's what I did. I started on October 11th, 1993. And I've been doing it 28 years in October.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
So-
I had just turned 23.
And you make music as well?
No,
No?
just listen and appreciate music and
yeah.
I would I would say that it's
Have you thought about
It's
writing
a-
a song? Have you ever tried to write a song? I'm just
I do think about it, especially it's funny that you should ask that because I just got into this book by Jeff Tweedy in which he I'm sure he's just being generous, but he insists that we try to write a song or a poem or something like that, and I keep hearing over and over again how important it is to find new hobbies as you get older to pursue. And I mean, I used to be kind of snobbish when I was younger as far as comedy, where it was like these, I would be derisive of people who dabbled or were not fully committed. And now I look at it as just everybody should try it, because any art form is worth doing, and probably worth doing even more so as an amateur, because you don't get caught up in all this competitive nonsense that makes it less pleasant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Do you remember the moment when you were doing comedy when you were like, okay, I'm pretty good at this. I think I'm gonna
I had that feeling the first night and then couldn't get it back for several years. but the first night was so good, and that's such a great question. The first night was so good that it hooked me. It's the way some people talk about certain drugs. They were hooked from the first time they tried it. And for comedy,
It's like
that
a
was
drug,
that was me. I said this is such an incredible feeling of, I wouldn't say power. I mean, I'm not power hungry, but just that people are thinking the same way you are. And it's almost it's a very interesting connection. I've heard it compared to conducting an audience as if they were musicians, that you're making them laugh in a direct way like that, and it's intoxicating.
Well, I think power is the right word. I mean, it gets a negative connotation, but it is like power.
Right, yeah.
You're trying to make everybody
Yes.
laugh, but you have
Yes.
the power of the room, and you can make the room have a great vibe, and that is in your control. And that's got, that feels great when you're playing a great show and you're looking around and everybody's having a great time. And I don't know if it's like you for comedy, but half the time on those great shows, you'll be done. You can barely remember the show. You're just so locked in and not thinking
Yes.
about anything, and it just kind of goes by and you're like, that was great. I don't remember anything.
Yes, it's like they compare it to a car accident. It feels like that so many times, and especially when you're locked in and in the moment. That's a term I hear used over and over again, and I dip in and out of it. Sometimes I'm incredibly self-conscious, and then other times I feel very, very connected and in tune.
Oh yeah, and we've played shows before where halfway through I'm actually playing a song going, we got 12 hours to drive tomorrow, blah. You can just and get through. I don't know if comics can do the same thing, but you're like,
Yes, absolutely.
autopilot, and then you're thinking every checklists are going down your brain while you're doing your act.
just muscle memory.
There's also and probably the same with music, especially when you're jamming, I would imagine, where there's the improvisation, that I'm doing on stage, but there's also, well, I just said that, I should say this after I get to this, and this will be an interesting riff to play off of what I just said, and oh, remember when I said this, and this is, so there's I don't want to call it chess because it sounds too highfalutin, but there is some planning. Maybe it's more like billiards or something.
Sometimes in the middle of a song when I'm singing, I'll think I need to do this between the next song. And then after the song's done, I'll forget. And then I'll remember while we're singing and playing the next song. I'm like, oh man.
Yes.
Yes.
Anyway.
That's just because you
all
smoke
the
too much
time.
pot,
That's probably the key.
So how long before you did the open mic? Because I got introduced to you on maybe season 2 of Last Comic Standing.
Yes.
That's where
Oh
I
my
first
gosh.
saw you.
Wow. That's a long time ago. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
So how clearly you didn't just jump from the open mic straight into that, but how long did it take
No.
to get to that? Because everybody, we've talked to, Kathleen Madigan, I think she was on your time
Yeah.
last we talked to, but we've talked about how, the singing contest shows, you don't really have to have anything but maybe a good voice, and that's, opinion. But with you guys, you had to, it seemed way more legit because you can't throw a bunch of comics up there. And I think Kathleen or somebody explained, you had to have legit because there were multiple episodes. And if you took open micers and they were great for 3 minutes, they're done for the series. They have nothing left. So you really initially had to have people that had been doing it for a while. So in case they stuck around, they had stuff and didn't embarrass themselves. Although some maybe didn't embarrass themselves after the show, but so how was that experience? How did you get there, and then how was the experience there?
I mean, I had been doing it for 10 years at that time, and this from music. There's a point in your development as an artist where you are. Not every artist goes through this, but an artist who grows, I think, would go through this, where your work is more accessible to the mainstream or the masses or the average person. So I had very short jokes, and they were perfect for television. And now my jokes are very long, and they take a long time to set up, and they're more subtle. So I feel like I was better for that show 10 years ago than I am now. I just feel like I've gotten so used to having a small but dedicated audience that I might not be as appealing to the mainstream. So I had these really. I guess the thing is that I was pretty young. So I appealed to a lot of people who would watch that type of show. I think that was the key. So I did pretty well on that show, but I feel like I'm a better comedian for some audiences, but not as appealing now as I was back then, because the other thing is I talk more about myself now. And back then I would just talk about things and stuff and just everyday items. And that's also more appealing to young people watching TV, because the attention span isn't as, because of the commercials and everything. So it was, but it changed my life, because I went from not earning a living as a comedian to earning a living as a comedian. I made do up to that time by doing writing things and some acting things, but I wasn't able to just live off my earnings from being on the road. And Last Comic Standing enabled me to go out on the road and make a living, and gave me a brief glimpse of what it was like to be a little bit famous. So that was really cool. And I also made. They always say on reality shows, I'm not here to make friends, but I made some really great friends on that show, like Todd and Alonzo. We talk very frequently, so that was really cool. And Bonnie McFarlane, who was another person who I've remained friends with. I mean, I'm friends with everybody from that show, but I talk to those 3 people almost on a weekly or at least monthly basis.
And who when you were coming up in the 10 years prior, I know you probably had a crew that you came up with. Who were some of the people that you were coming up with that maybe you chummed around with? It's always interesting to see who came up together.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few very famous now comedians, when I started in Boston, who had started a couple of years ahead of me, named Bill Burr, and then Dane Cook and Robert Kelly, and then there were people a little bit younger than me, like Mike Birbiglia and Eugene Merman. And so it was a nice collection of sort of mainstream comedians and then sort of alternative type comedians. It was a very encouraging and supportive bunch. Now they will talk about how they used to insult each other, but I think that was, they really were, we were all rooting for each other and recommending. The important thing was we were recommending each other to different people in the business. And that was one of the best pieces of advice I got early on, is that most of your work will come from other comedians recommending you. So be a decent person to work with. And the other thing that artists love to champion is originality. So that's helpful too.
And I'm sure there's plenty of comedians that don't want to help anybody along when you're coming up and think that you're taking their gig or something like that. So
Just
it's nice
like
to have
some musicians?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah,
for sure.
it's human nature, I think. But I found early on that it was that you would watch somebody and you would think, that person is incredible, and I feel worthless because they're so good. Why should I even bother? And that's one attitude. But the other attitude that was much more helpful and productive was to say, I should work harder and also tell everyone I know how great this person is, because it's a healthier policy in my stomach to spread some optimism instead of the poisonous resentment and jealousy, which I have plenty enough to go around. I just it's just when you're in a competitive field, that the instinct is their success is canceling out mine, and it's just, you realize that it's not true. There is plenty enough to go around. It's not always given out evenly nor immediately. Right? It requires so much patience, and it's sort of proof that you love it if you stick around long enough to get some of the success.
Yeah,
that makes sense. And talking about people helping each other out, that whole Tourgasm TV show, was it HBO, I think?
Yeah.
Dane went and took, I think, you and Bobby Kelly, I forget who else was on, sort of a documentary type thing. How was that? I mean, it reminded me of those. Were you like basketball? So you probably did the And One mixtape tour.
Yes,
it's like that.
It was It was very much like the And One, but it was grueling. I have to say, I know there are musicians who travel in vans and things like that, which is a worse situation than we had. We had a pretty nice bus, but just having to do a show every night and spending the next day traveling to the next show is exhausting, and mentally I wasn't the same when I finished as when I left. I had much more energy and optimism when I left than when I got back home. It was trying on my self-esteem, because I felt like a supporting player to the biggest star in comedy at the time, and we would do interviews sometimes, and of course they wanted to talk mostly to Dane, and I wasn't strong enough in my brain to understand that this wasn't an indictment on my talent or my future, and so it was difficult. I'm glad I did it in that I became a better, stronger comedian, I think, in that I had to go in front of an audience that was not there to see me and project some sort of confidence and assertiveness so that they would pay attention to me for the 15 minutes that I was on stage. But I wish we had spread out the tour a little bit longer and stayed in some hotels rather than trying to sleep on a moving bus.
Well, to your point, I mean, the sleeping on the bus stuff and all that, you can grow accustomed to that. But what you're describing is basically if 6 different bands or 3 or 4 different bands got on the same bus together and drove around. So you got, if you're on a bus as a band, you're kind of one gang, a camp. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. You're all there to do the show together. But what you're describing is the opening band, the middle band. There's 4 bands, and that's not only you have to get together as a band or get along, you got to get along as a whole group. So you guys are like independent bands there that I can imagine, would rub each other the wrong way because you don't have to spend a lot of time together as a comedian. As a band, you got to learn how to, you guys write, you at least got to get along. You guys can semi get off by yourselves. And that would be a weird thing to be trapped on a bus with a bunch of people like that.
Yeah, that is the perfect analogy, and probably why it was so difficult, because there were three separate dreams and three separate acts on that bus, and it was but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, and 3 strong opinions, I'm sure, too.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, comedians are opinionated.
Yeah, they are.
I like it.
Well, that's
Good ones are, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Have you ever opened or had musicians open for you at shows? Have you ever been in that situation?
Yeah, I have opened for some musicians, and it's usually a very enjoyable experience because I used to open for the band, the house band at the Cafe Wah in the Village, and it was the people didn't expect it, so they were usually pretty good about it. I would get nervous every time because you never knew what the audience would be like, but for the most part I really enjoyed it. And then this past year I had my friend Andy Frasco just by himself and with someone on guitar opened for me at my show in Boston, and that was really, really fun. I always knew that there was a lot of overlap in the lifestyles of comedy and music, but it was really talking about the writing aspect over the past several years when I started to become recognized as a pretty good writer, that I've heard from musicians saying that the writing, at least the approach and the process, is very similar, and that you write a lot of stuff and only a portion of it makes it through, and you're constantly tweaking and fine tuning and adjusting, and it's the one thing is that it is so pleasurable when it works, and the good thing with comedy is you get that immediate feedback that night, usually when you write something. And music, it takes a little bit longer, and unless you're trying out songs as you are writing them. But it's exhilarating when it comes together, and some nights it's harder than others, but I always the biggest switch in my ability to create was when I stopped dreading failure so much and avoiding failure. Because when you're avoiding failure, you're also avoiding taking any big risks, and you're avoiding you're avoiding growing and changing and making adjustments. So I really, once I said, if I fail, not only is that okay, it's actually good, because it is a symbol that you tried something difficult, and that is how I found I've been able to grow and become better. And I hear the same thing from musicians, that the fear of failing can be so paralyzing.
Yeah, and you are definitely one of those that I think us laymen look at as a craftsman, like chose words chosen very carefully. To like you're I've thought about this today. Your abbreviations, state abbreviations, to me, and I'm not just trying to blow smoke, but it's up there with Who's on First. Some
Oh, wow.
stuff. Bill Cosby's
Thank you.
thing with the Hi Mom. It's just one of those
Yeah.
things that's
Oh,
so well
wow.
put together that I think that is going to completely stand the test of time, regardless of anything else have you done. And it must feel good. I don't know if you've ever thought about it in these terms. But to me, if I was a comedian, I don't care what else I did. I've written a legendary bit that people that are fans of comedy are going to be listened to for a very long time. It's so well done, man. Well done.
Oh my word, that is so nice to hear. And I mean, the interesting thing to me.
Well, before you get in there, how long did it take to really cull that bit together? When did you nail it?
That's what I was going to answer. It took over 20 years, literally.
Oh my God.
I had the premise of how most of the states start with the same letters and that it must have been difficult to abbreviate them down to 2 letters. I had that premise and actually did it at a show in around 1996 or 1997. And then it wasn't until I would say 2014 or 2015 that I made it into a fake documentary, because it might have been a little bit earlier than that, but not much earlier than that, where documentaries used to be about big things like World War II, and maybe you'd get one about Bob Dylan or the band, but for the most part, they were about really heavy, big things. And then probably with the digital revolution, documentaries could be about anything, and that was my way in. So it took a real big change in technology for me to have a premise for that joke that really worked, and so it took me so long to write it and combine other jokes that didn't work on their own to feed into it. And so I'm proud of it, because I have this idea that if nobody else is doing something, a joke about something, and you should stick with it until you finish it. Because as you know from writing and performing, there are very few original ideas. And I mean, I could tell you where the inspiration came from as far as the techniques and things but the overall combining and synthesis of the different ideas is, I feel, original. So that's why I'm very proud of that. Yeah.
No, for sure. And I guarantee there's other comedians, we do it as songwriters all the time, where somebody writes a song that's like, Hank Williams does it to me, just, hey, good looking, what you got? Like, very simple. You're like, why couldn't I come up with that? And the premise seems so obvious. It's amazing that you were able to work on it for 20 years and nobody else came up with it. And it's one of those, it's like, it's so obvious. How did nobody get it? But just the way you meander from that to Breakfast to, I mean, it just goes all over the place. It's not just about it's a work of art for sure.
Great. It's great.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the Breakfast was just a separate joke about how I couldn't order at the omelet station because I felt so guilty about putting the omelet chef out.
And who wants to be an omelet chef?
Exactly.
And you mentioned it earlier, which I think it's interesting because you're known as the observational comic. I don't. That's probably a hack word in your.
No. It still works. Yeah.
But definitely with your last special, and probably just because of the subject matter, it became way more long form and way more personal. I don't know if you'd been working towards that, or you've been open with your, going through the depression and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of what the last special was based on. Were you leaning out of jokes and into long form before that, or how did you get to that? Or was it the kind of the breakdown in the middle where you kind of weren't doing comedy that you sort of reevaluated everything? How'd that come to be? Because I know it was a rough time there for a while.
Yeah, that's such a great question, but I would say the best answer, the most complete answer, is that it was sort of out of necessity, in that I looked off, and because I wasn't able to get myself together by the 8:00 showtime, so I was often unshowered and unshaved, and my hair was a mess. I wasn't getting regular haircuts, and I had serious tremors in my hands from anxiety. And so you would notice my hands shaking while I held the microphone, and then I had this terrible habit, and I don't even know if I've been doing it during this conversation, but when I'm contemplating, I stick my lip out like this, and I bite it, and it would bleed sometimes. So I had all this motion going on, which was very distracting, and I had to address it. And the most comfortable way I have found to address anything is through jokes. So I wrote these jokes, and I, over several months, had opportunities in front of either audiences that were generous and just easy, I guess you would put it. They just were excited to be at a comedy show, or somebody who was booking the show who was very patient and nurturing to me, and particularly at a comedy club called the Comedy Studio in Cambridge. Now it's in Somerville, Mass. It was in Cambridge and Harvard Square at the time, and I would talk about how I was feeling and work these jokes that I had spent the day working on, and that was very, it got me out of the house, and it got me around people, which was very therapeutic for me. And then it also allowed me to ease my way back, because I had taken several months off from performing because I was so sick, and I was in the psych ward, and I talked about the psych ward, and as soon as a couple of weeks of trying out these jokes, I realized that the people were reacting in a stronger way than they had to anything else I had talked about before that. People were coming up to me and sharing their stories, and so it was a combination of necessity and then this incredibly positive feedback that I got that said, "Oh, just keep going further with this and use your discomfort as a compass." The more uncomfortable I was sharing something, the better it would work. Yeah. I remember talking about this story about being recognized from Last Comic Standing while I was in the psych ward for treatment. And at the time when it happened, I thought, this is either the lowest point in my life or will someday be the funniest story if I can figure out how to tell it. And almost as if it was a blessing. The first time I told that story, it worked, and I thought, what a fortunate way to redeem this very uncomfortable time in my life. It's the story of great songs too, where somebody talks about this painful breakup, and they literally make a life out of it, give it its own life, and it winds up healing, and so it's really extraordinary.
So did the anxiety and depression, I'm sure you had that all along, but you talk about the first time ever you went out, killed it. It felt great. So clearly you weren't dealing with that kind of stuff within comedy right then. Did it just get worse and worse the longer you did comedy? Was it a slow burn, or was it like a trigger, something that went off that just sort of triggered everything? Or was it just something that slowly built up to where it was unmanageable at a certain point?
Yeah, I think it's that final thing. I had episodes over the years, but they never lasted more than a season, sometimes a season and a half. So I would have a terrible winter, and then my summer would be fine. My spring would be okay. I'd get better, and there was some seasonality to it. But then in 2015, I fell into this depression that was combined with anxiety, which was something I wasn't used to, and I'm not sure why that aspect joined in, and that lasted from spring of 2015 until the fall of 2017, so over 2 years, and that's when for the first time went into the hospital, because I felt like I can't get out of this, and I was thinking, oh, will this be my life from here on out? And I mean, it was gradual falling into that depression, and then it was gradual coming out, but I've never felt, honestly, I've never felt better in my life. I've never been more positive. I've never felt this sturdier in facing setbacks. And I mean, if I were to lose my phone later on this afternoon, I'd probably run screaming through the streets. But I know that within 24 hours I'll have some perspective on it, and I'll realize that it's just a phone. But years ago that might have, I always thought that when I was first emerging from my illness, that had something tragic or devastating happen to me, it could have set me all the way back. But I feel confident that at least through my practices and my support team and my wife, that I have enough of the tools to weather most storms, at least as well as the average functioning adult would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just
ahead.
want to say, I deal with seasonal depression too, and I've accumulated a few tricks. So I put sunscreen on in the wintertime because
I love that.
it just smells like the summertime. And
Yes.
you mentioned earlier, I listen to the Beach Boys a lot in the wintertime because it makes me think of summertime.
Yes, that makes me, that is so true. There is music that brings season with it. Yes.
Yeah. And then my other trick is to keep green plants inside around during
Brilliant.
the wintertime. Yeah.
That
there's-
is,
in case
I'm
anybody
going to have
Not
to
bad.
adopt the sunscreen and the green plants. We
sunscreen
don't
really
have enough
works.
plants. Yeah, that is really, because smell is such a powerful memory sense.
Yeah.
We can all vouch for the sunscreen bit when we get in the van. It's like, who's wearing? Oh, he's wearing. But I was just thinking,
Oh, that's awesome.
I may be way off here, but it must have been just life in general for you, because you're built like a football. You did play football, I think. Football,
Yeah,
basketball, like a
yeah.
big jock. You should be a jock and have that
Yeah.
mentality. And just from your comedy and watching interviews through over the year, you've got the body of a jock and the brain of like the chubby theater student, that's a Buddhist or something like that. So it had to be kind of strange coming up as a kid, and even, in your 20s, maybe even now, but just what you project, not even personality wise, just physically wise, is not necessarily what you bring intelligence or intellect wise. I don't know. It must have been
Yeah,
a weird thing to deal with.
Yeah, there is an assumption associated with my appearance that I would be more, I guess, bro-y or like that. But it might be because I had two older brothers who could be rather aggressive, and my father was he never hit us, but he would always tell us stories about the fights he got in as a kid, and I was very timid around other kids in that regard, and so the issue I had were the expectations of my aggressiveness, and I felt like I let a lot of coaches and people down because they had higher expectations for me than I could produce, and I really wanted to be a dominant force in sports, but I didn't have that mentality, and I also am I don't take criticism very well, so I get very sensitive and I turn inward and I pile on, and so it's very difficult. But I think that's one of the great benefits about aging, is that nobody has any expectations of me for athletic dominance anymore. So I can just be myself and be soft and silly, and that I've found, and I'm not sure that this happens for everybody at the same age, but I will say that at any age, it's so valuable, is just kind of accepting who you are and your flaws and the things that you don't do well, or the things that make you uncomfortable, and saying, well, that's just me, and I'm going to stop criticizing myself or feeling guilty or trying to change my essence, I guess. So that, I think, along with a hundred other things, was very helpful in recovering my mental health. Was just not feeling so bad about not having been a football star when I was built like one.
Right, and I think that is one of the best things, if we're lucky, about getting older. It's not that you don't care anymore. You just know what you shouldn't care about anymore. There's things you care about. You give up all the older you get, you turn in the old man thing, like, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care what you're saying about me. I don't care.
Yes, yeah.
No, go ahead.
It's so freeing, right? It's such a load off. Yeah.
You'll get there
I'm
someday.
so young.
Yeah,
I don't know what y'all are talking about. I'm so worried. Hey, we're coming up on the hour mark, and so I got to let you go. But I wanted to ask you, what was the first time you remember hearing about Papa Willie? What is your own personal Willie Nelson experience of life? Or maybe you don't have one, and that's okay too.
No, I won't say this is the first time, but it's the time where I felt most connected to Willie, and I imagine this is not uncommon because it was such a big song, and the timing of my life where it was. I mean, I'm getting emotional thinking about it, so I will try to maintain my composure. But if we were not on camera, I would be in tears. The single mother and the son, and probably the daughter, there is a really special connection there, and this probably resonates more for people who are married. But when you're a single mother, when you're the son of a single mother, there is kind of a protective, husbandy way that you're connecting with.
You're gonna make me cry.
Connecting with your mother, and you're always on my mind. I think about my mom and what we meant to each other.
Yeah, you're gonna mess me up too. Great.
My eyes are still dry.
Are you crying?
My parents are still together, so.
Yeah.
I have two boys. They're twins. They're 14, and a daughter. And I'm a single mom too. So.
But it goes back to what we were talking about.
Boys.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, man. If you can write a song like that it's so general. He's not talking about single mothers. He's talking about anybody.
I'm not sure he even wrote that song, but he did make it. He did make it famous.
Whoever wrote that song, it's just amazing that you can put together notes and words.
But Elvis put it out and didn't make it famous. Papa Willie put it out in his. It was the right time or something. I don't know.
The right voice too. You need some vulnerability when you're singing that song, and Elvis is, maybe a little too oomph. But it is amazing.
Yeah, and my mother would sing it to me. I'd sing it to her.
Oh man, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. Well, how do we say something funny, JB?
No, I was just going to say that I rewatched the last special recently, the Great Depresh. If anybody that's listening hasn't seen it, really a great body of work, and just the way, like I said, I've known you since Last Comic Standing, and just from hilarious then, a completely different beast now, but still the same person, and then a classic bit somewhere in the middle. You're doing just fine, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate it. And this was joy, pure joy. So thank you for sharing that with me and including me.
Big on our list. And if you ever get through Nashville, you need to let us know, and we'll.
Absolutely, I would love that.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
So
thanks, Gary.
Okay.
Gary Gulman's my favorite comedian.
I think these intros, and I've changed my mind. These intros and outros are fantastic. I'm really liking the direction they're taking. Enjoy your groceries.
Free Britney.
I know your mama's name.
Don't be an asshole.